Today we'll be covering one of the most infamous missing person cases on the internet, Lars Mittank. Okay, so this is easily one of the most confusing and frustrating cases I've ever heard of. And to be quite honest, I still don't know what actually to believe. When the security tapes of the last known footage taken of Lars Mittank started to circulate the internet, they showed some very frightening behavior that led many to speculate their own conclusions into what must have happened. Lars Mittank was an engineer from Germany who was described as a free-spirited family man who adored adventure and traveling. Lars was a really smart dude, and rather than going to college, he went to a trade school for engineering where he received top marks. After graduating, he was quickly hired to be the manager of a power plant, which was a good job, but would require him to move 150 miles away from his family. That was a hard adjustment for Lars, but his new job meant he had his financial support to travel home to visit his parents, as well as travel the world on his grand adventures. In 2012, Lars' dad suffered a stroke and needed assistance to take care of himself. Lars didn't give it a second thought and dropped everything to be with his father as much as possible, foregoing a lot of his free weekends and vacations to care for him. In July of 2014, Lars decided he was due for a vacation. He'd been working for pretty much 2 years nonstop while traveling back and forth to take care of his dad between shifts. Yeah, he needed a break. So he and his 5 friends decided to take a trip to Varna, a coastal city along the Black Sea in Bulgaria. While it wasn't the usual type of trip he'd go on, Lars' friends had an open spot for their reservation at the resort, and Lars jumped at the chance. So on June 30th, Lars and his friends flew to Varna and checked into the Hotel Viva, a resort nestled along the Golden Sands beaches of the Bulgarian Riviera. Lars and the gang spent the first couple of days doing whatever the heck they wanted, while his friends opted for lounging by the poolside and relaxing at the resort. Lars would often leave to explore the city and hang out with other travelers. Lars loved sports and outdoor activities, and he'd found a group of guys playing soccer on the beach one of the first days that he was there, and had ended up hanging out with them for the good majority of the trip. 4 days into the trip, Lars and Mars Bars reconvened at a local bar to watch Costa Rica play the Netherlands in the World Cup quarterfinals match. The late night revelry lasted well into the early hours of the morning, while the patrons partied, drank, and cheered on the match. Lars was wearing a jersey from his favorite German team and brought some flags with him from the clubs he played on back home that he exchanged with other bar goers. A group of young men had noticed Lars, and whether it was because of the jersey he was wearing or the flags he was passing out, they got upset and tried to pick a fight. But Lars didn't want to fight. He and his friends had settled the men down and put a stop to the bickering before it got out of hand. At around 4 in the morning, Lars and his friends were some of the last people to leave the bar, and 2 of his friends suggested they stop at a local McDonald's to grab some food before heading home. But Lars, the athlete, wasn't into fast food. He said he didn't want anything and was going to just walk the half mile back to the resort. If you offer me salty, hot fries after a long night of drinking, I will not have the power to just say no. It's just not like me. While making the walk back, Lars was jumped by a group of men who roughed him up a bit. They were either Russian or Bulgarian. Lars was able to get away from them and make it back to the hotel, but he suffered an injury to his jaw and a ruptured eardrum from the attack. Ouch. Lars slept until about noon, and when he woke up, he texted his girlfriend back home about the men the previous night and how he believes someone had hired them to attack him. He told her about the quarrel that he had gotten into with the men at the bar the previous night and remembered them telling him that it was very easy to get someone beaten up in Bulgaria for a price. Hold up, is that true? Bulgarians, you had the floor. Lars' girlfriend pleaded with him to see a doctor about his ear, but he didn't think of any of the clinics would be open on the weekends and said he was hoping his ear would just heal naturally. That night, Lars went out with his friends again, and the rest of the weekend wrapped up pretty smoothly. Just before noon on July 7th, Lars checked out of the hotel, but his ear was still in a lot of pain. Lars and his crew were supposed to fly home that night, and Lars was worried that flying in his condition could seriously damage his hearing. So he and one of his friends took a taxi to a medical center where the doctor told him he definitely couldn't fly in his current state and referred him to a hospital for treatment. Rather than going straight to the hospital then, Lars decided he'd go after his friends left for the airport so he could be with them during their last night in town. His friends offered to stay back with him and to get a later flight, but Lars insisted that was too much trouble and that he would heal up and figure out a way home. At around 8 p.m., Lars waved goodbye as his friends climbed into the shuttle to go out to the airport. After that, he took a cab to the hospital where he was seen by an ENT specialist. Somehow, there was a miscommunication between Lars and the ENT at the hospital because according to the records, Lars was never officially admitted to the hospital, but the specialist was still able to prescribe him some antibiotics. The doctor diagnosed him with a ruptured eardrum and wrote him a prescription for 500 milligrams of medication called cefprozil, a common antibiotic for ear infections. After 2 hours later, Lars left the hospital to find the same cab that dropped him off still waiting for him. Lars got in and asked the driver to take him to the nearest pharmacy. The first pharmacy Lars went to didn't have enough cefprozil to fill his prescription, so the cab driver took him to another pharmacy. After finally filling his prescription at 10 p.m.-ish, Lars asked the driver to take him to the cheapest hotel nearby. The driver told him since it was the summer months, all the hotels in town would be booked, but he did know of one that would probably have some vacancies in a poor area of the city. Lars agreed, so the driver took him there and dropped him off. Lars tipped the driver heavily, then booked himself a room at the hotel with his credit card. Now, sometime after 11 at night, Lars went down to the hotel bar to get some water to take his antibiotics with. After that is when his behavior started to become a little bit more bizarre. First, Lars called his mom back in Germany and asked her to charge more minutes to his cell phone. Lars had a smartphone of his own, but he left it at home when he traveled and used an older cell phone instead that you had to buy minutes for. Up until this point, Lars' mother hadn't heard from him and had no idea what he had gone through. She could tell something was off in her son's voice as soon as she answered the phone. That was when Lars finally told his mother about what had happened during the trip. He told her about the fight at the bar, and the men who jumped him, the ruptured eardrum, and how the doctor at the hospital had mocked him and wouldn't speak to him in English. His mother Sandra was upset about the news, but told Lars not to worry, that she would file a health insurance claim for him and arrange a way for him to get back home. Moms are seriously the best. Sandra called Lars back a few minutes later and said she was having trouble filing the claim, and that's when she noticed that his behavior was becoming more cryptic. Lars kept telling her that there was something wrong with the hotel and saying that he had to get out of there, which as a mother thousands of miles away, that's not really the first thing that you really want to hear. Activate mama bear mode. He also made a strange request and asked that she cancel his credit cards. Now apparently the clerk who had checked him in at the front desk and made a photocopy of his credit card and had never seen a hotel do that before, and it totally freaked him out. Sandra told him that she'd called the bank and asked him if it was possible to unblock the credit cards after they had been canceled, but they said it wasn't possible. But Lars didn't care and was insistent, saying he had enough cash on him to make it home and that really needed her to close the account, so she did. Sandra booked Lars a bus ticket for the next night that would get him out of the city and told him to rest up before then. But a few minutes later, Sandra got another call from Lars, sounding even more paranoid than before. He wasn't specific, but he kept telling his mom that something was very off about the hotel and that he thought his room had been wiretapped and that people were listening in on him. Sandra tried to comfort him, but he abruptly ended the call after telling her that he needed to get out of there. At 2:30 in the morning, Sandra got another call from Lars. He sounded even more frightened than ever before and whispered that he was being followed by 4 men and that he thought they were trying to kill him, then hung up. At 3:06, Sandra got a text from Lars and asked her what cefzil 500 is. At 3:15, he sent the same text again, and it seemed he was either confused or suspicious about the tablets he had been prescribed. Same here, this is getting really spooky. I mean, was someone really following Lars? Or was it all in his head? By that point, Sandra was like, "That's it. I'm getting you out of there ASAP," and booked him a flight out of Varna for 4:20 that day. At 5 in the morning, Lars was seen on video cameras hailing a taxi to take him to the airport. The passenger in the cab at the time said she remembered that Lars' pupils were extremely dilated at the time. When he got to the airport that morning, he called his mom again and was careful to keep it short so that he didn't use up all his minutes. He told Sandra that he had met a man at the terminal who had explained to him how to send money to someone through the Western Union banking system, and he asked her to send him some money through it. Sandra was confused because the Mittanks didn't use the Western Union banks, but she agreed to still send him 500 euros via the system. She also sent him the info for his flight that afternoon and asked him to go to the airport's medical office and have a doctor make sure he was okay to fly. Lars told his mom that they wouldn't let him fly or drive and that he looked disheveled from hiding all night. Sandra suggested he go to a bathroom and clean himself up, then call her back when he had new info. Sandra set up the bank transfer for Lars, and then a few minutes later she got another call. This time, all she could hear was an unintelligible whisper. Then Lars abruptly hung up the phone. She tried to call him back, but would never hear his voice again. And at about 9 in the morning, Lars went to the airport's clinic to get checked out by a doctor. The doctor examined and talked with him for around 40 minutes, gave him medicinal eardrops, and cleared him to fly. The doctor attempted to give Lars more of the antibiotics as well, but Lars refused them. No surprise there, it sounded like he was not liking whatever those meds were doing to him. Regardless, the doc told Lars he was safe to fly as soon as he signed off on a waiver that he had been examined. Lars signed it, then whispered under his breath if he could use the restroom and come back real quick. That was when the infamous security footage would capture the last known images of Lars Mittank bolting from the terminal and fleeing the Varna airport. Once outside, he hopped a fence and disappeared into a sunflower field along Bulgarian Highway A2, where he would never be seen again. For the next couple of hours, Sandra would attempt to get a hold of Lars, but with no success, she called the honorary consulate in Varna to explain the situation. An hour later, the consulate called Sandra back and told her about Lars' escape from the airport, saying he left all of his personal belongings there and that he hadn't been seen since. The next day, a missing persons report for Lars was filed and an investigation was launched to look into the bizarre disappearance. To this day, Lars Mittank has never been seen or heard from again. The investigators showed Sandra the footage of her son at the airport and would soon release it to the public to see if anyone could aid in the search. In the footage, Lars looks over his shoulder as if he's perceiving some sort of threat or danger, but there's clearly no one else trailing him when he's running. And that's unfortunately pretty much all we've got. A wide array of theories have cropped up all over the internet, and I've got to be honest, I think one of the reasons why this case is so confusing is because all the theories that seem pretty plausible. So let's go over some of the most popular theories. Obviously, the first theory in this case that most people immediately assume was that Lars was experiencing some sort of mental break. The footage of Lars at the airport had led a lot of people to believe that he could have been hallucinating something that wasn't there. This is a plausible theory, as Lars had been under a significant amount of stress being a caretaker for his dad while also being a full-time manager of his power plant. Another stressor was the head injury that Lars received the night he was attacked. It's possible the head injury was far worse than he could have thought, and some brain damage or swelling could have caused Lars to become more paranoid. Then there's also the antibiotics that Lars had started to become wary of. While not usually a side effect of cefprozil, in some very, and I mean very strange cases, an uncommon side effect of the antibiotic can be hallucinations. Now, experts have weighed that they don't believe that the cefprozil was the direct cause of Lars's behavior. Some have pointed out that Lars had been drinking on the trip and could have done so while on the meds, which could have caused an adverse reaction. Could the stress of Lars's work and home life combined with a head injury plus antibiotics and cocktails resulted in a paranoid psychosis? To many, this seems to be the most plausible, but just because we can't see the threat in the video doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. Sandra doesn't quite believe this theory in full. Allegedly, she claims she was shown actual footage that wasn't released to the public of Lars when he got outside of the airport that made her think otherwise. In those tapes, Sandra said she saw Lars ducking behind buses and cars in order to hide from a police vehicle. After seeing her son's behavior in those tapes, she said it seemed like Lars was in the right mind, that he was acting with a plan and was cautiously moving to avoid the police. However, that particular tape has never been released to the public, so we won't actually know or be able to judge for ourselves until we see it. The next popular theory is that Lars really was in danger. Some people insist that Lars was perceiving a threat and that it had something to do with the 4 men who jumped him after the bar. Believers of this theory think that the 4 men who attacked him on July 4th must have stalked Lars for the rest of his vacation in order to try and finish what they had started. Of course, the big question of this theory is the big glaring question of why? Why would the men continue to stalk Lars after jumping him and allegedly letting him go? Some speculate that maybe the fight wasn't finished when Lars broke away and that he could have hurled one last insult over his shoulder before running off, angering the men so much that they'd stalk him across the town. That would explain the phone calls to his mother when he was paranoid about being followed by the men. Also, Bulgarians, still feel free to weigh in on if what the men at the bar said was true. Is it really easy to hire someone to beat someone up for you? Is there an app for that? I don't know. The last theory that people believe is one I like to call the risky business theory. Some believe that Lars was possibly part of a larger crime network where he had helped peddle some illegal things. If that was the case, they speculated that Lars was probably involved against his will, and maybe the men who jumped him did it as a threat, like, get involved with our operation, or a busted ears, the least of your problems. People had also pointed out that the same cab driver had driven Lars multiple times throughout the trip and had even waited 2 hours for him while he was in the hospital. Could the driver have been hired by the men to make sure that Lars completed his drop-off? It would also explain why Lars was seen waiting anxiously at midnight in the hotel lobby the night his friends left, and why he avoided police when he ran from the terminal. but there was no physical proof of this theory. The airport had his suitcase and all of his personal belongings, and nothing about his things indicated involvement with any sort of trafficking. Lars had also never been involved with any illegal matters before, and most of his friends and family doubted this theory. They didn't think that Lars had a good enough reason to put his cushy job and steady relationship on hold for a quick walk on the dark side. To this day, Lars has never been found, although multiple alleged sightings of him have been reported all over the world. It's truly one of the most bizarre and baffling cases that still leaves people wondering to this day. Lars Mittank, where are you? Thank you guys so much for watching.